good.
Oh, that's true. You'd have to unmute it for him to talk.
Yeah.
All right. I went ahead and turned the stream on.
Okay.
And we've got.
Record and click on it and go.
Yep.
Right.
I think you're good.
Right.
And I don't think anyone will be working this tonight. If they do.
No, I don't expect John out yet on things.
Now, did you see that email Dell sent out about him?
No, I didn't see
He
it.
killed the leukemia cells, but his white blood cells are down very low.
Well, he's subject to infection pretty easy. You got to watch out
Yeah.
what he's doing. Well, and that reminds me. I'm getting emails to the elders thing, but not through the members. And something or other makes me think, see, I'm not very good on this tech thing. Did you or somebody send out a deal sometime back checking to see people's emails, and if you didn't respond, you'd be off or something like that?
No, no.
Well,
What?
I'm not receiving them anymore on the members'
From the
side.
members list.
Yeah.
Have you looked in your spam folder?
Well, nothing shows up in it. I haven't actually
Okay.
clicked on it.
You might want to double check. Are you still at the AT&T address?
Yes.
Okay. I'll double check, make sure that's on there.
Okay.
Because if you're getting the elders email address, email,
Should be
you
able to get
you should be getting from members,
That's what
yeah.
I thought too, maybe. I heard, okay, all right. Well, something makes me, now, see, I thought whenever I saw that a couple months ago, that it was some spam thing. I didn't hear anybody here saying that they were gonna send out
Yeah.
a check on all the emails, and you have to respond. If you don't, then you're subtracted.
Oh,
It said something or other like that.
not that I know
Not
of.
aware,
Yeah.
that Kelvin did or anything like that on it.
No. He says we've not made any changes on it since we started with the new email system about 2 years ago.
Okay.
So.
Well, I'll check the spam thing and see if maybe it's sitting over there.
If not,
I'll check. I'll try to remember Sunday, to confirm one way or another.
okay, yeah.
In good shape on it.
Yeah, let me know what you find out by
Okay.
looking in the spam there.
All right.
Yeah.
Are we gonna have a handout?
I'm sorry.
Will we have a handout?
No, I didn't get one on things. Well, it's been a few years. You actually have one, because this is a repeat of some of the things I studied years ago on science on things, although I reconfigured it to just the flood type of situation on it. But no, I didn't. I probably should have on things. I've got
Really,
5
really?
points here and 4 or 5 on the next one on things.
I mean, I think it's really gonna be neat. I don't remember ever studying this specifically,
Well,
but I remember a lot of
yeah,
stuff.
a lesson on geology. The Bible and geology is what I had it titled. And so some of the first part, the history, the geological history, and then the flood, and then so a few other things too that I won't be covering tonight, but I retitled it just this for the
I
next
don't-
things. But it's been,
I
I don't know
don't-
how
I
many
don't-
years.
I don't remember that at all.
Okay.
Man.
Well, I thought maybe
Well,
the
that
other
should be
day-
all new for me then, 'cause I don't.
do it again on things, because you said you didn't remember anything like it on things, but you might have to get started.
Are you just gonna do this one night?
Yeah.
Just, well, you're right, just
Yeah.
one night, and then, see, November, middle of November, Dale's gonna be gone for 2 Wednesdays, and I'm planning on, Genesis 10 and 11, the origin of the nations. And that's a study we've done in the past also.
That does sound familiar, yeah.
70 nations mentioned there, and those that study it truly, they can trace all the existing nations back to there on things.
Well, this is a
Hey,
study
how's
I
everybody
love.
doing?
Good, Ron.
Don't you love study the Old Testament, Donna?
Yeah, yeah.
My favorite.
I don't know where I brought my book. Have it.
Well, I did too. I remember.
Don't need it tonight, because it's a standalone study, I guess you might say.
That's all right.
I've forgotten the
I'm
book.
going to try it.
Okay, yeah, the book.
You brought the most important one.
Tonight.
No, my friend is 89, she said, it doesn't get any better. Yeah. With certain things, I can do really good. Certain things, you can ask me anything about, not anything, but about, entertainment, who's married who. I can maybe watch a movie, I can tell you what other movies they were in, or the show, who they're married to. But important stuff, my mother, I said, if you just took, I know, I wish that was Bible, I'd be really good, but my memory's funny that way.
Hi, guys.
Put your forehead on, unless you. Pull out, sure. Don't give him too much at one time. Yeah. Hi, guys.
You doing, Kyle?
Man, I'm finding a frog here split 3 ways.
Shit of 4, huh?
Miss Pat, how are you?
Super good, thank you very much.
All right. This month.
I'm excited about this, getting this Old Testament
Donna, how are
class
you?
here.
Okay.
All right. Give me a high five.
Oh, I'm one of those ones, I think the high-fiving thing is silly. That's just me personally thinking that.
Oh, you want the
sorry.
fist bump?
I don't, that makes sense, that kind of makes sense, like Howie Mandel, because, he doesn't like, but it's safer that way, just, get germs and stuff, but the high-five stuff,
You smash the germs. What?
well, that would do, yeah.
Well, shaking hands is inherently dangerous.
Yeah, it really is, yeah.
You don't know what that guy's been doing with his hands, or her hands.
Didn't they used to greet with a kiss, too?
Yeah,
Didn't imagine that.
but I don't think that was on the mouth. But then I want somebody, well,
No.
We need to end this conversation.
They're just, yeah. I said, consider yourself hugged, yeah.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. Of course, this really older person, I said a really funny joke, and he wondered that, like, oh, okay. Okay.
oh, it's fun. I have fun.
Yeah.
If I'm walking down the
Kids love
street and I see a bunch of kids coming to me, especially if it's a black family, and there's usually that little boy that's just full of it out in front, right?
Yeah.
And so we saw a group one time, there was 6 kids, and they were all dressed up, looked like they were headed for church, And so we went by. I just held up my hand to the first kid.
Yeah.
Every kid gave me
Yeah.
hit my hand, and then I got
Kids
Dad
like
too.
that, yeah. That's
And of course, Dad and Bob were just laughing,
Yeah.
Well, this may be about it this evening. I understand Stephanie won a trip to Florida.
She did.
Oh, she won one.
From work.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, Jensen used to be here, but
Yeah,
now.
my aunt.
Jensen is,
You're
I
fishing
saw him.
fast.
Okay, all right, he's out there wandering around. But
I think she
Hi,
gets
Kathy,
Get
how
ready
you
to go
doing?
on swimming.
Then,
a little early, don't you think?
Hat didn't get picked up.
I don't
Oh,
go on
okay.
that trip
Because
where
he
I-
normally Well, she normally would call us, but I don't know, I think Stephanie picked her up on Wednesday, or John, but she would normally call us and ask us to come get her.
Usually sometimes Stephanie might or something like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
Okay, well,
I've had it for
Oh,
years,
well.
so you know how that is.
iPad, if you're listening.
yeah, right. I think, yeah.
Geological
That's
defect.
true.
It's called by the-
So she won't be here,
And they lay down and behave.
unless John shows up. Is he doing
Yeah, this will hold
well?
up to nothing.
Is John Neff doing all right?
Well, I understand, I didn't get the email, but I guess it did what it's supposed to do,
Yeah.
killing the bad cells, but his weight is way down,
Yeah.
lower than what they thought it would be, so that makes him susceptible to,
Infection.
yeah, right, things like
Anything.
that.
Oh, yeah, he's trying to be careful.
Yeah.
So it gets built
yeah,
back
be
up
careful,
again.
yeah. That's all that John reported a little bit ago on it, so, he, even if he felt like being out, he probably better not be out with all the stuff floating around out there.
Yeah.
And I've heard that with any kind of cancer patient, sometimes your ability to fight infections is way down.
That's why they wear those masks.
Yeah, some do that, you know, keeping stuff getting in there.
Yeah.
Well, Dale asked me to fill in while he's gone, and as most of you know, from the past at least, I generally don't take up someone else's material. So I planned on this one night study here, trying to stay in Genesis at least. Now I know that in the past probably looked at the flood record, but maybe not some of these details. So I'm going to try to relate to you in this particular study. And as you can see, it's the geological effects caused by the flood is what we're going to be looking at in our studies here this evening. And in order to get to the flood, I'm going to begin here in a moment with the biblical divisions of geologic history, because I think we need to kind of look at the background of what leads up to the flood, and then we'll try to, at the end of the study at least, based upon something said by the Apostle Peter, why that modern day geological studies are way off, way off. And it's due to the devastation caused by the flood, and them willfully ignoring that, forgetting that very significant historical event. So that's kind of where we'll be going, at least in our studies here. I don't have a handout, but you'll have a few things up here on it, and if you want one, well, I can certainly get you outline after the fact if anybody wants one. Let's begin with word of prayer. Most holy and divine Father in heaven, we're thankful to you for all the blessings you've bestowed upon us this day, and thankful for our health and our well-being, and thankful, Father, for the many things that you've so richly blessed us with, so that we can have some enjoyment in life, and so that we can use these things for our well-being and to help others, and especially further the cause of your kingdom. We're thankful for the spiritual blessings we enjoy in Christ, thankful for redemption and shed blood upon the cross, and the forgiveness of sins this provides for us, and pray, Father, we would be blessed with the assurance in our hearts of a right standing relationship with you, and being able to be on our way to the eternal home you promised to us, and remain faithful to your will. We're thankful, Father, for your written word and for the guidance it provides for us, and thankful, Father, for even the revelation of earthly things that you've given us so that we might know and be assured of your creative powers and your willingness to sustain heaven and earth as it is at this time. And remains for our blessing day by day. We're mindful, Father, of those remember are gone because of illness, those recovering from surgeries and treatments, and pray you'd be with them all and provide them the healing that they desire, and pray, Father, you'd be with them, provide the comfort they need in their time of trial, be your will. We ask all these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. Geology itself, it's the science of the earth, dealing with the history of the earth and its life, especially as recorded in the rocks. And geology, you may or may not be aware, is a field of science that has been most effectively used by skeptics in attempting to discredit the Bible. The modern day analysis of the Earth's structure, especially the rocks that lie in the upper part of the Earth's crust with their fossil contents, been built into a rather elaborate naturalistic view of the origin and history of the Earth, and it's an origin and history vastly different from what's recorded in the Bible itself. But I've continued these studies, and some of you may have sat in studies some years ago, the Bible and science, whenever we looked at subjects like this, that if we want to have true knowledge in any field of science, and this one included, we've got to consult the one who is the creator of the ends of the earth. That's how God is described in Isaiah 40 and verse 28. You may recall he challenged Job. Job thought that he knew a lot of things, and whenever God spoke to him, he said, "Where were you whenever I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you whenever I created all these things?" Well, Job wasn't there. No man was present, but yet modern man thinks that he knows how the earth came into existence and how the animals came into existence and things of that nature. Well, God has the same challenge to those type of people today. In actuality, the processes of geology, whenever they're studied objectively, are all quite consistent with biblical references to such processes. And the aspect of geology most important to biblical studies is the historical aspect. And just simply because current evolutionary geologic tables contradict the very first chapter of the Bible, it's just important that we look at studies like this and see what the Bible actually does have to say about these matters. And I mentioned just a little bit ago, I want us to kind of lay some historical background before we actually get to the flood, because I think it's significant to our study of the actual effects caused by the flood. The Bible plainly implies that there are at least 5 great ages of history, each of which has produced substantial segments of the geological formation. Now, don't confuse that with the 3 spiritual ages, the patriarchal, the mosaical, and the age of Christ. We're talking about it from a historical perspective, geologically speaking. I think you'll see what I mean whenever we break this down. The initial act of creation, for example, included the structure and the materials of at least the Earth's core and some sort of crust and surface materials. You go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 2. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth, it was in existence, but it was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. So there was some kind of a crust, some kind of a structure, some kind of materials existing at that point. Now, following this initial creation of the heavens and the earth, we have God's work of 6 days of creation. On the 3rd day, a tremendous amount of geological work was accomplished. Genesis chapter 1, verse 9 to verse 10, God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. This has to have included the processes of hill, mountain formation, especially by folding and uplifting the Earth's crust. And this process would have been accompanied by great erosion, valleys, even some elements of canyons into existence at this time. A redepositing of surface materials also you can visualize as these waters would be flowing down in new low-lying water areas because of the creation of these of the earth itself, the land mass itself, and the seas that would be accommodating then a different level of water. Now, on the same day, God made vegetation to appear. Genesis 1:11 through verse 13 records that, and this implies there was now a uniform covering of fertile soil over the earth's surface in order for the seed to sprout and bring forth the herbs and the trees and the grass and things of that nature. So now we've got basically two elements forming the geological effects that we see on the earth. Now next, with the fall of man, a new order of things followed, not only in God's spiritual economy with respect to man, but also with respect to the earth itself. The earth at that time, when I pushed the wrong button, I went back instead of forward, was cursed for man's sake. A lot of people, they look at that and say, well, man was cursed. Well, if you look at the record, the earth was also cursed at that particular time. The earth was cursed for man's sake. Genesis 3 and verse 17, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. In chapter 5 and verse 29, talking about a time of Noah coming along, and God called his name Noah, saying, this one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. So the curse just was, it affected the earth itself. Geologically speaking, indicating affected the earth. Due to this curse, the whole creation was delivered into the bondage of corruption. It was subjected to death and decay. Paul writes about this in Romans in chapter 8. You may be aware. Romans in chapter 8 in verse 20 through 22. And he relates this to the hope that we have, and it also has a relation to, as he says, a hope that the earth itself has, creation itself has. Paul says the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption, death and decay, into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now, because of this curse of the ground, this curse upon the earth. The whole creation is groaning under the weight of this curse that God put upon the earth. Now, keep in mind, the world before the flood had at least low-lying mountains. Genesis 7:20 indicates that. Had rivers. Genesis 2 and verse 10 indicate, and seas. Genesis 1 verse 10 that we looked at. And so must have experienced many geological activities. Decay, erosion, sedimentary deposits, all of which went on for what appears to be some 1,500 to 2,000 years. In the book of Job, there's a reference there to the erosion processes that would have been going on at this time, because they are subject to corruption, and still does even in our day and age. Job 14 verse 18 and 9 said, mountain falls and crumbles away. The rock is moved from its place. Water wears away stones. Torrents wash away the soil of the earth. So there's a biblical reference to this erosion process due to the fact that the earth was placed under a curse at the time of the fall of man. And these erosion processes, these decay processes, were all in effect from the time of creation, from the time of the fall, until we finally come to the flood. And the greatest physical convulsion that has ever occurred on the earth since the creation itself is indeed the flood. Genesis in chapter 6 in verse 17, God said, "Behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, and which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die." In Genesis chapter 7, verse 19 through 21, you have record that God did indeed bring these flood waters upon the earth, and says the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. All the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. Now you might note there that these passages talk about life being destroyed, the animals and man. We're going to say in just a moment, in the same context, that God said he was going to destroy the earth itself at this same time. And I'm saying that this is really the greatest physical convulsion that has ever happened on the face of this earth since creation itself. God miraculously bringing all into existence. There's just no escaping the conclusion that the flood was the most significant event, geologically speaking, that has ever occurred on the earth since the earth's creation. According to Scripture, the great flood in the days of Noah was a worldwide cataclysmic event in which the world that then existed, being overflowed, flooded with water, perished. Look at what the Apostle says about this event in 2 Peter in chapter 3 and verse 6. Now verse 5, he's talking about these scoffers willfully forgetting. We'll make a point of that later on. That by the word of God the heavens were of old. They came into existence by creation, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed, this is the time before the flood, perished, being flooded with water. You can't tell it without a little bit of knowledge of the Greek word that's translated flooded there. Some translations say it was overflowed with water. The earth was, and it perished. The Greek word translated overflowed or flooded there occurs only 5 times in the New Testament. And every time it's used with respect to the flood. And it is a word from which we get our word cataclysm, cataclysmic. It was cataclysmically overthrown. It wasn't just a minor event that took place. In comparison to the floods of Harvey, it was cataclysmic in comparison to that. Far, much more greater than you could think of in any modern day flood. That's the meaning of the idea of the word that is used here in the passage. You know, it's just obvious that the 30% of the earth's surface that is dry land has in the past been covered with water, and that most of the rocks on the surface were originally laid down by moving water. Even modern day geologists admit that. And they can't figure it out. The reason why they can't, we'll get to in a moment, because they willfully forget this one event, the flood. What had taken place, geologically speaking, during that time. It's rather evident the Earth's crust has been subjected to tremendous stresses and strains in the past. These have resulted in the complex features on the Earth's surface. Great faults and folds, tremendous mountain ranges, widespread volcanic activity, earthquakes, and other such wonders all bear witness to intense and unusual geophysical happenings in ancient times. And in the biblical context, the original perfection of the created world remained much the same until the onset of the great flood. Then
the structure of the Earth's surface, no doubt including much of the crust and its atmosphere, was catastrophically and completely changed. Genesis in chapter, nope, I don't have that one up there, I guess. I said I'd show you passages here where God bringing in the floodwaters did not just destroy life, animal, and the life of man. Genesis in chapter 6 and verse 13. Genesis 6 and verse 13. God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." So God, through the flood, destroyed not just life as we know it, but his intent was also destroy the earth, bring this destruction upon the earth. Genesis in chapter 7 and verse 10 and 11, it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. On that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Some translations say that the fountains of the great deep erupted. They burst forth. That's the idea here of them being broken up. And then you've got that 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 6 passage where the Apostle Peter says the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. The world wasn't just the living beings in the world, but the world itself perished at that time. These passages, and there's others, indicate that the earth's original perfections were all devastated and rearranged during the flood and its aftermath. The simultaneous breaking up, bursting forth of all the fountains of the deep implies the onset of great masses of water from below the earth's surface, and also volcanic activity. So it wasn't just rains coming down from heaven. This passage is actually talking about water coming up from underneath the existing crust of the earth, which would then, as we'll get to in just a moment, form things like the mountains and the valleys and the canyons and things of that nature that we see. Now, one more thing about the biblical divisions of geologic history. After the flood, with the conclusion of the flood period, God promised that no more worldwide earth-shaking water destruction would occur. Genesis 9 and verse 11, the promise, "I establish my covenant with you, Noah, never again shall all flesh be cut off by the water of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." You see again. Now we're not talking about local floods going to bring in havoc and destroy everything. He's talking about the whole earth would not. And verse 22 of 8, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. In general, uniform processes of nature would prevail and have prevailed after the flood and as long as the earth remains. The Bible, as I mentioned before, gives numerous references to normal erosion processes, like that one in Job chapter 14, and even more spectacular geological processes such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, all having an impact, of course, on the just believe the flood was responsible for the Earth's sedimentary rocks and the great beds of fossils. You know what happened about 200 years ago, the origin of species, and people believing in evolution, that type of thing. But up until about 200 years ago, they all basically accepted what we see here in the biblical record and acknowledging it was the flood that was the greatest event that impacted the geological landscape that we see today. Cal, you had a question or comment.
Well,
I had to run through that right quick to get to what we're after here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll just go ahead and mention the way you're presenting this, we're assuming that when God was doing his work, God was doing it in God's days, not man's days.
Yeah.
Which I believe.
Yeah, right.
He didn't invent time until what, the third or fourth day. That's when he invented time. And so before that time, but I think one day for God is as 1,000 years for man. So How fast God worked, I don't know. I will acknowledge that God, if he wanted to, could have created the earth in its present geological form with an established geological record already there. In other words, dinosaurs never really lived. God created the bones and everything, as they say. I acknowledge that God has the power to do that. Okay? And I acknowledge that God has the power to do all of the works that he did in 24 hours, or it was his time. I personally think it was his time. And I think when he gathered all the land together in one place, that's when he made the seas. But what he did, I think it was null and void. I believe land didn't exist. It was there. Because there's more than enough water to completely cover the earth. So I think what he did is he gathered that land in one place. And I would think that in one land they may have had hills and mountains there. I don't know what it looked like. But he had it all set up there for man. And it stayed that way until the flood. And I agree with you there that when the flood happened, I think that's when the land was divided into the different continents. Because I remember reading, probably 40 years ago in National Geographic, the writers writing in there showing how the continents would have fit together and
I've
how
seen those pictures.
they compared the rocks at these different places. And they're the same type of rocks here. It's like they should have been at the same place at the same time. So I see all that type of stuff. But I think when we acknowledge the power God has and the way he can do it, it makes sense. But to me, this is what makes sense. But this didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process. And
But and I understand where you're coming from. My studies have indicated, from what I've studied at least, and I've related that in class in the past on things, that God created everything we see in Genesis chapter 1 in 6 literal 24-hour periods. I believe the evidence is clear on that. Exodus chapter 20 just nails it down to me on things because it's compared to man's work day on things today. And God, I believe, had the power to miraculously do all this in a 24-hour period a day. Could have done it even
and the physical effects could have, I admit,
and I believe
the
the evidence
physical effects could have occurred in
yeah.
24 hours
Yeah.
if he wanted to occur. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, any other questions or comments on what I presented here, at least about the biblical division of geologic history? I had to set that up, I think, a little background for us to go to the next major part of what I wanted us to look at, the geologic implications of the flood. If such an event as a flood has occurred in Noah's life, second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Chapter 8 and verse 2 tells us that after the flood, waters were there 40 and 150 days, about 190 days. The waters receded continually from the earth, and the end of the 150 days, the water decreased. Verse 2, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped at that time, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Fountains of the great deep refer to waters gushing forth from under the earth's surface, is what that's a reference to. Now, these great volumes of water which were turned loose on the earth, both from the fountains of the great deep and the windows from heaven, must have, of absolute necessity, accomplished a vast amount of geologic work and in a very short period of time. The Bible speaks of these waters going and returning continually. Verse 3 of chapter 8, the waters receded continually from the earth. Literally, in some of these various translations bear this out, the waters were going on and returning, going and coming. They were turning back and forth. So to visualize these waters over the whole face of the earth, churning like you might have in a washing machine or something like that, had to have caused a great amount of geological effects on the landscape at that time. Now, the flood explains how and when the mountains were formed. There were mountains in the originally created world, as made mention of, that were relatively low and of gentle slope, not the rugged, tall ridges of today's world. The waters of the flood covered these mountains to at least 15 cubits, be 22.5 feet about. So the fully loaded ark with a total height of 30 cubits could float over all the mountains at the peak of the flood. Genesis 7, verse 19 and 20, we read earlier, indicates that. Well, after the original landscape had been devastated by the flood waters, these kind of changes then took place. Look at Psalm 104 and verse 5 through 9. In Psalm 104, verse 5 through 9, talking about God, you laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains, just like we read there in the account of the flood. But at your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. Now, a lot of translations read verse 8, they went up over the mountains, they went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. Literally, verse 8, and there's several translations that bear this out, the mountains rose up, the valleys sank down, is the meaning of the Hebrew terms there. The English Standard Version says something similar to that. The New American Standard Bible reflects that. The International Standard Version, the New American Standard. I'm just relating some of these versions. American Standard Version been around since the early 1900s. The New Living Translation translated, they say literally, mountains rose and valleys sank to the levels that you, that is God, decreed. When did it happen? Whenever the flood took place. The Bible tells us exactly. God supernaturally pushed up great mountain ranges in the continental areas to balance the new depths of the ocean basins. As the mountains were brought up, valleys, canyons were formed, allowing the waters to then recede into our current levels of oceans and seas round about. This biblical teaching is supported by the fact that most of the great mountainous areas are considered, even by evolutionary geologists, to be quite young, uplifted since man has been on the earth. And it's clear that they've all been underwater. They're formed largely of marine stratus. Even, again, geologists acknowledge that. Got marine fossils in them, even near their summits. They've got these marine strata
I'm in
and
the
fossils.
top of the Rocky Mountains,
That's right.
14,000 feet,
Right.
and you'll find fossil sharks' teeth.
That's it.
And you'll find
Yeah.
fossils,
Right.
and you find petrified wood up there, even that far up.
All that indicates that it was under this overflowing of water, and then these things rose up then after the fact then, or during that time on things, and deposit all these things, which, during the flood, erosion, resedimentation must have taken place on a gigantic scale at that time. After the floodgates were restrained and the fountain of the deep stopped for a long time, a lot more geologic work would have been accomplished as the masses of water were settling into new basins and the earth was adjusting itself to new land and water balances. Some people say, well, you think Grand Canyon was created at that time? Well, I think a good bit of it may well have been on things. Now, it could have been there was a start of the Grand Canyon whenever God brought the earth into existence in Genesis chapter 1, 9 through 10, and there was erosion for 1,500 to 2,000 years before the flood ever took place. But certainly during this time it could have taken place whenever there had to be a way for all the water to get off from the earth that was over the face of the earth. And don't discount the possibility that God miraculously created some of these things at that time also. He miraculously brought about the fountains of the deep opening up and the heavens depositing rain from up above for 40 days and 40 nights, he certainly could have miraculously had a hand in all these other things at the time of the flood. Cal?
Well, the whole Colorado River is a geological fault.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he was ripping things there would be a fault there, a crack there,
Yeah.
that the water that was in the Great Basin area, that was immense inland sea, not real deep, but it takes a long time for water to drain out.
Yeah.
And the Colorado River is the route that it took,
Yeah.
and it would have done enormous damage during that time.
Yeah.
Now people say, well, where did all the water go? Well, when we drill wells, okay, we encounter salt water.
Yeah.
So once you get down below about 3,000 feet, almost all the water that you encounter down there is salt water.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and it's old salt water.
Yeah.
So he just put the water back where it was before.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was salt or fresh when it was there before, but what's down there now for the most part is salt water.
Right.
And when we drill wells, there's an awful lot of wells here that will produce 4 or 5 barrels of water for every barrel of oil.
Yeah.
There's that much water down
Yeah,
there.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. On things, yeah. That's right. Yes, Debbie.
Where were you reading that the mountains rose and the valleys?
Psalm
Psalm.
104.
But that's saying that the
The
water-
mountains went up. Some translations say they went up over the mountains. The waters went up. They went down into the valleys, the place which you founded for them. But I mentioned that's this translation. In English Standard Version, a whole host of other translations, they translated a lot more literally. The mountains rose and the valleys sank
That's what
to
happened.
the levels that God decreed. That's where I'm getting at. Just look at other translations besides the King James Version, New King James Version. You'll see how that. And mine even has a footnote. It has a footnote at verse 8 that says the mountains rose up, the valleys sank down. That is literal translation of what took place at the time. I've got to hurry. I got 2 more points here, right quick. Great numbers of plants and animals buried by the sediment under conditions favorable to preservation and fossilization at that time also had to be because of the flood. And you can experiment with this yourself with a water hose, the kind of sedimentation and the things that you can create in a matter of minutes with it. And this is something taking place over the whole world. And you know, people they can't figure out why there's not many human remains. Humans could float, swim, be up the top of these waters,
For a while.
and they'd probably decompose rather than be buried in the sediment.
Or get
But
eaten.
dinosaurs, which I believe were in existence at the time, they're heavy. They can't float. They're going to be down at the bottom of a lot of the things. But you can find them all over the place as far as that goes. A lot of things would decompose and wouldn't be found. And this is all consistent with geological findings also in the strata that they look at the time. One other point, I think is a key point. It's now geologically impossible to discern the Earth's history prior to the flood, at least on the assumption of uniformity with present condition. You think about it. God destroyed that world that existed before the world. It perished. That's what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3. And he says, scoffers willfully forget that. And modern day geological people, they forget that. Either willfully or unwillfully, they don't take into consideration that God destroyed the earth with this flood. So whatever geological formations were before, let's say that there was this stalactite out there in a cave. They see one today and they say, well, uniformity, let's see, this thing is 3 feet tall, and so it must have been, and right now it's only growing 1/16 of an inch per 10 years. It must be around millions of years. They can't measure it that way because the flood, whatever was before the flood, was not only destroyed but also totally rearranged
Scrambled.
by the flood, yeah. So you can't measure things by the principle of uniformity, which is what's used by modern day geologists today on things. That's the final point leading to things. See, Peter says that these scoffers, they willfully forget that the Word of God, let's go back, verse 4. These scoffers, where is the promise of God's coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. All things haven't continued as they were from the beginning of creation, because as Peter says, they willfully forget that that world that did exist at the beginning of creation had an end. It was destroyed by the flood. It perished. So see, geologists today and evolutionary people today, they try to say, well, everything's the same from the beginning of the existence of the heavens and the earth, and it's not. From the biblical perspective. Question or comments? I know I've run through this pretty quick. Donna?
We're the ones, people who think the flood was just local there. How do they get that? I've heard that some
Local
people,
flood? Well, there are different ways that they do get that. One, they think it's just impossible. Scoffers about it. They think it's just impossible for the whole world to be underwater on things. But they also think that man was only in that one area at this time on things, and so there'd be no need for a worldwide flood. But the record very clearly says that there was a worldwide flood at that time, regardless of whether man was everywhere or not. And a man had to be a good bit of places, because we find remains of people in other places besides just there, as far as that goes. But a lot of it they get from that. I've heard some argument. Jesus relates to what was going on before the flood in Matthew chapter 24 regarding the destruction of Jerusalem, and says people were going on marrying, giving in marriage and everything else, and then they weren't realizing that the destruction comes. So they say, well, see, Jesus puts in the context of just a local judgment on Jerusalem, and so therefore the flood was just local. I've heard some make that argument also, but there's a whole host of references in the Bible that clearly indicate it was worldwide.
I think it was worldwide.
Yeah.
But every people have a legend of a worldwide flood. Even the primitive peoples
Yeah.
have never come in contact. I think it's interesting that
I think most of it is just a matter of this question whether God could do something like that.
they just don't want to.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that about 40 years ago, a copper hammer with wood was found preserved in rocks at the very bottom of the stratum with all the fossils and stuff. Quickly suppressed.
Yeah.
Could not be there. Okay?
And I mentioned before, the geological evidence
This is
clearly
a
indicates that
hammer
the flood was
that
worldwide,
man would
because you've
use,
got the
okay?
same geological things, strata and marine things up in every mountain range in the whole world on things. So, sometime or other was under
Quickly
underwater.
suppressed.
Yeah. Yes, Pat.
Now, would God have this in this flood? Would He have also destroyed animals like fish that didn't breathe air?
Well, you would think that
Would
the
think-
fish would still be there, and
They
and some birds would, of course, be on the ark, but didn't have any place to land for
those
a
were all
long time. But
preserved,
fish
but
is still.
I don't
Now, it
think
might be
big
God
fish
did
are.
destroy them. I don't think it's mentioned anywhere whether He
No,
destroyed the
it's
fish
not.
at the
It
time.
says something about the air breathing,
Yeah.
but
I mean, He could well have destroyed the fish, but not any
He
reference
could
to
have,
it.
but
Yeah.
since it was just rainwater,
Yeah.
and
Seemed
I've always
logical
thought,
to do that.
and there could have been prehistoric fish, you know, that, or anything that, well, anyway.
You know, some people don't realize, but we basically have dinosaurs in the sea right now.
Oh, yeah.
There's whales that are bigger than any dinosaur that ever walked face of Earth.
So they seem to survive.
I want to know what happened to the Titan.
Oh, well,
That's what I want to know.
Happened to what?
The Leviathan.
Leviathan.
The Leviathan.
Oh, the Leviathan? Well, I contend dinosaur, and
You think he died? He went
just went
away?
extinct because of lack of food and other reasons. I mean, there's always times whenever animals go extinct because of change in environment and lack of food. Now, I contend that
There was systems before the flood, and before the flood, the earth was surrounded in a canopy like a terrarium type of thing, so vegetation was just
Curious about everything.
just phenomenal.
Right, right.
With the breaking of that, everything we have now, dinosaurs changed so much, you didn't have near the vegetation, and most people that study dinosaurs say they're all vegetarians.
Right,
They
right.
ran out of
Except
food.
the T-Rex, how many days you did.
Yeah.
In the movies, the T-Rex was a vegetarian.
Well, he just had big teeth.
And I will want a copy of it.
Okay, all right, I'll get you.
I was trying to make those, no, I can't write that. I won't be able to read my writing back
Okay,
then.
now, I should have gotten some, I
Yeah.
didn't.
Good lesson, right, very good. You're a wise man. Very knowledgeable one, too. 'Cause I know that's all you know.
Yeah, it's all there. Trying to bring it out.